The request was delivered quietly, away from cameras, ceremonies, and the carefully arranged smiles of royal life. Camilla wanted Prince Edward to delay a decision that could permanently secure Lady Louise's place within the royal archives. She expected hesitation. She expected loyalty to the crown's present order. Instead, Edward looked directly at her, refused the plea, and signed his approval, transforming a private family disagreement into a battle over memory, inheritance, and who would guard the monarchy's truth. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Edward did not arrive at Windsor seeking confrontation. He carried the final authorization, the written approval, placing Louise inside a protected program for long-term archival responsibility. The Royal Archives, the secure collection preserving official papers, private letters, ceremonial records, and historic family material, offered her more than access. It offered purpose. Years of quiet study could finally become a future built on merit rather than publicity. Camilla understood the stakes. She asked him to wait until a palace review decided which relatives should receive lasting access to sensitive records. Her voice remained controlled, but the request carried power. A delay could create new rules before Louise entered the succession pathway, the route through which a trainee could inherit greater responsibility. Edward knew what that meant. His daughter could meet every standard and still find the door closed before the decision could become impossible to reverse. The Queen Consort placed one hand over the unsigned page and asked him to consider the wider family. Edward looked at her hand, then her face. Refusing the king's wife could be called disloyalty, yet surrendering would tell Louise that patience, dignity, and hard work could be erased by influence. He moved Camilla's hand aside, signed his name, and pushed the page across the table. "I am considering my family." The words struck harder than anger. Camilla stared at the signature and realized her influence had reached a boundary Edward would not let her cross. Louise's program would include supervised work with historic correspondence, ceremonial records, and collections linked to Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II. Those papers held family memory and evidence of old loyalties. Whoever preserved them could shape how future generations understood the monarchy. Yet Camilla's silence raised a darker suspicion. Her plea had never been only about timing. Something inside those protected collections, or something Louise might become by entering them, had frightened her enough to intervene personally. To understand why Edward's signature carried such force, the people standing on either side of that page, and everything they feared losing, must first be understood. For Lady Louise, the archives were never a shortcut to status. They represented something far more personal, a path into the history shaped by the grandparents she loved, and the family whose expectations had followed her since childhood. For Edward, protecting that path became an act of fatherhood. But for Camilla, Louise's growing connection to those sealed rooms threatened to strengthen a branch of the family that had remained quiet, respected, and increasingly difficult to control. Louise had never chased the attention of royal life. She had built trust through restraint, study, and an interest in conservation, the work of protecting historic material from damage or loss. That mattered because the archives did not reward fame. They rewarded patience, discipline, and the ability to handle private family records without turning them into power. Edward wanted that future for his daughter. He did not want a ceremonial position, a public role granted mainly because of birth, to become her only option. He wanted Louise to earn responsibility suited to her character. Yet when he found her sitting alone with a handwritten note from Prince Philip tucked inside a history book, he saw how deeply the conflict had wounded her. Louise asked whether she should withdraw before the disagreement grew worse. She feared people would call her an intruder, using her surname to enter rooms others could not reach. Edward closed the book gently. His sadness hardened as he realized how easily her humility could be used to make her disappear. "You will not surrender a future you have earned." Camilla feared something different. She knew the protected collection contained decades of correspondence, tracing private loyalties, old objections, and the emotional order that existed before she became queen. Those records mattered because they could reveal who had been trusted, who had been resisted, and what Philip believed Edward's family should protect. The confidential recommendation deepened that fear. It described Louise as discreet, unusually trusted, and capable of becoming a future guardian of private family history rather than a temporary researcher. It also placed her near papers connected to Philip's plans, including notes that may have outlined responsibilities he imagined for his granddaughter. Louise felt gratitude and guilt in equal measure. Edward saw the emotions and understood that protecting her path was no longer about one appointment. Camilla's plea had exposed a deeper struggle over memory, legitimacy, and whose quiet service would survive inside the monarchy's permanent record. But their determination had begun earlier, before the signed page and private refusal, during one ceremony when Louise's future was diminished without warning. That ceremony became the point of no return, the moment Edward stopped believing patience alone would protect his daughter. Months before Edward signed the archival authorization, Lady Louise stood inside St. George's Hall, expecting to receive recognition for her preservation work. Her name had appeared on the original program. Her grandfather's collection was to be mentioned. Yet moments before the ceremony began, an aide quietly removed her presentation from the order. Louise remained composed, as another royal initiative took its place. Edward watched her applaud politely, and understood that the exclusion was neither accidental nor harmless. Louise had spent months preparing for that moment. She had completed supervised research for a Windsor heritage ceremony honoring conservation, craftsmanship, and the protection of historic family collections. Conservation meant the careful work of preserving fragile records and objects before age or damage could erase them. Her contribution focused on carriage records, handwritten notes, and material linked to Prince Philip's lifelong interests. The warning came minutes before guests entered. An aide approached Louise and told her the program had been rebalanced. Her remarks were gone. Her name had vanished. Edward saw his daughter fold the speech once, then again, before placing it beneath her chair. She smiled when the applause began, but the smile carried pain he could not ignore. Another presentation replaced hers. It promoted a new palace heritage structure led by figures closer to Camilla's household. The change mattered because whoever directed that structure could influence which collections received attention, which family contributions were remembered, and which younger royals gained a permanent place inside the monarchy's historical work. Louise waited until they were alone before admitting the truth. She felt as though someone had deliberately closed a door in front of her. Edward tried to comfort her, yet the quiet way she spoke made his disappointment turn into anger. This was not simply a lost speech. It was a warning about how far her future would be allowed to reach. Edward returned to the empty hall after the ceremony. Beneath the chair, he found Louise's unused pages. The opening line thanked Philip for teaching her that history survives only when someone chooses to protect it. He read the sentence twice, then carried the speech away. A documented account from the planning office later confirmed what he feared. Louise's removal had been requested during a private call where concerns were raised about giving future expectations to younger relatives. From that night, Edward accelerated her archival application, knowing patience had become dangerous. He understood that silence would not protect Louise. It would only make her exclusion easier to defend later. When Camilla finally asked him to stop, Edward was no longer responding to a single plea. He was answering the humiliation he had watched his daughter endure in silence. Camilla entered the meeting expecting negotiation. Edward entered knowing the negotiation was already over. No aides sat between them. No senior courtiers softened their language. On the table rested the final approval granting Louise her archival pathway. Camilla asked him to delay it for the sake of unity. He answered that unity built upon his daughter's exclusion was not unity at all. Then, the conversation crossed from palace procedure into something painfully personal. Camilla began with the palace review. She argued that giving Louise a protected route into the archives before that process ended could create competing expectations among younger members of the wider family. The review, a formal examination of who could receive long-term access to sensitive royal records, was meant to prevent confusion. Edward heard something else. He heard another delay disguised as caution. Edward answered with facts. Louise's placement was professional, supervised, and based on documented work. It did not grant constitutional power, meaning authority connected to governing the monarchy, and it did not raise her public rank. It simply allowed her to train, preserve, and prove herself. Camilla warned that his daughter was being placed inside a struggle she might not understand. He looked at her and replied that Louise understood exclusion because she had already lived through it. The queen consort then crossed the line. She said the appointment could appear to be an attempt by Edward's branch to protect its relevance. His expression hardened. Months of research, discipline, and quiet service had just been reduced to family ambition. He asked whether Louise would ever be judged on her work, or whether her humility would always make her easier to remove. Camilla shifted her request. She asked that the collection connected to Prince Philip be taken out of Louise's training. That single demand exposed the real fear. The papers mattered because they contained judgments, family loyalties, and written intentions that could strengthen Edward's position. He then revealed, through a documented recommendation already held by the archive, that Philip had supported Louise's future involvement in preservation work. The room went still. Camilla pushed the authorization toward him and said, "Ask her to wait." Edward did not raise his voice. He turned the page back, signed it, and held her gaze. "I will not ask her to step aside." Camilla's confidence gave way to disbelief. Edward's hands remained steady, though refusing the king's wife carried a cost he understood. His signature ended the meeting, but its authority rested on something older than either of them had expected. The real power was not hidden in Edward's anger. It was buried inside the rules governing the archives, and the promise Philip had left behind. Edward's refusal would have meant little if Camilla possessed the authority to overturn it. She did not. Years earlier, Prince Philip had helped establish a protective arrangement for the preservation of his private working records. The clause was narrow, carefully worded, and almost forgotten. Yet it gave Edward a decisive voice in selecting a family representative for long-term conservation training. The power Camilla believed belonged to the palace had already been placed somewhere else. Charles read the clause without speaking. The archive separated official sovereign records from private family collections, meaning papers created through the monarch's public role were governed differently from personal letters, notes, and working files. That distinction mattered because Camilla's household could influence palace policy, but it could not automatically control every private collection entrusted to separate guardians. His preservation arrangement created a supervisory panel, a small group of professional archivists, and one family representative responsible for approving training and access. Edward's branch held that family voice. The clause did not hand him unlimited power, but it gave him enough authority to protect Louise from a decision driven by household pressure. The king felt the trap close around him. Supporting Camilla would publicly defend his wife, yet overturning Edward's action would break their father's documented wishes. Charles wanted to protect her from humiliation, but he also knew Philip had designed the settlement precisely to stop one household from controlling private history. Edward received confirmation through a written notice from the archive. He did not celebrate. He closed his eyes for a moment, saddened that protecting Louise had required him to invoke his father's authority against his own family. The victory felt heavy because it secured his daughter's future while exposing how divided the monarchy had become. Philip's recommendation made the position even stronger. The late Duke described Louise as patient, discreet, curious, and free from personal vanity, qualities he believed were essential when handling sensitive history. He also warned that archival access must never become an instrument of household influence. Those words suggested he had anticipated a future struggle over who would control royal memory. Charles finally set the file down and removed his glasses. Camilla asked whether the decision could still be reviewed. He looked at her, then at the clause carrying his father's authority. Not without breaking father's settlement. Camilla understood immediately. The obstacle was no longer Edward alone. Philip's surviving judgment stood between her and the appointment, and even the king could not remove it without revealing exactly what the settlement had been created to prevent. What had started as a quiet refusal now altered schedules, relationships, and access, forcing every person involved to live with a decision that could no longer be reversed. The following morning, Lady Louise received a sealed confirmation welcoming her into the archival program. She read it twice before speaking. This was the opportunity she had worked toward, yet it arrived surrounded by conflict, resentment, and the knowledge that her father had challenged Camilla to protect it. As one door opened for Louise, another closed elsewhere in the palace. leaving the queen consort to confront a reality she had failed to prevent. Louise held the letter with both hands. Her appointment would begin with a probationary period involving cataloging, conservation ethics, restricted access protocols, and supervised study of Prince Philip's working papers. A probationary period was a trial stage in which her judgment, discipline, and handling of sensitive material would be tested before greater responsibility could follow. This mattered because one mistake could end the future Edward had fought to secure. The palace adjusted Louise's schedule, so the work would remain private rather than become a public-facing engagement. She would not receive applause, a new title, or ceremonial attention. She would simply begin. That choice protected the archive from spectacle, but it also proved that her appointment was based on service rather than status. Louise looked at Edward and asked whether accepting the place would deepen the family division. Pride flickered across her face, then guilt replaced it. He told her that declining now would reward those who had confused her gentleness with weakness. His words steadied her, though she could see the exhaustion he tried to hide. For Edward, that protection carried a price no document could ever record. Edward then showed her an internal notice from the supervisory panel. It confirmed that Camilla's household had lost its planned role in reviewing access to Philip's collection. The same notice stated that Louise could not be removed by a household request. Only misconduct, professional failure, or a unanimous panel decision could cancel her place. Louise entered the archive and paused at the inner door. She placed her grandfather's old pencil inside her notebook before beginning the first catalog. The gesture was small, but the meaning was enormous. She had not entered to claim the past. She had entered to protect it. Camilla received confirmation that afternoon. She folded the notice once, placed it inside a drawer, and asked that no further meetings be scheduled. The queen consort had failed to stop the appointment, and now even silence could not disguise the limit placed upon her influence. Yet Louise's hardest question remained unanswered. That evening, she turned to Edward and asked what he had sacrificed for her. Away from advisors and sealed files, father and daughter would now face the private truth beneath the entire battle. There were no courtiers present when Louise confronted her father. No archivists, no palace officials, and no carefully prepared explanation. She simply asked whether he had damaged his relationship with the king and queen for her sake. Edward could have softened the truth. Instead, he told her everything. The ceremony, the hidden review, Camilla's plea, and Philip's recommendation. Louise listened without interruption, then made a decision that transformed protection into personal responsibility. Edward began with the one truth he needed her to understand. He had not secured the position simply because Louise was his daughter. He had protected the process because she had completed every requirement placed before her. Philip's recommendation was not a royal favor, meaning an advantage granted through family rank rather than earned ability. It demanded the same scrutiny, discipline, and professional standards expected from any trusted archival trainee. Louise felt the guilt before she felt the pride. She feared her appointment had created lasting tension between Edward, Camilla, and Charles. The opportunity mattered because it gave her a real future inside royal service. Yet it had also forced her father into open conflict with people he had known and trusted for decades. She asked whether those relationships could ever return to what they had been. Edward did not pretend they would. He admitted the family might never recover its old ease, but he would fear himself more if he had stayed silent while her future was quietly removed. Camilla's plea had not created the danger, it had exposed it. Charles now stood between loyalty to his wife and respect for Philip's wishes, while Edward had chosen the only side he believed he could live with. Then he gave Louise a copy of Philip's documented recommendation. Beneath the formal wording, the late Duke had added one handwritten instruction: let service, not prominence, determine who carries this forward. She read it slowly and understood the deeper test. The archives were not simply a secure role. They demanded that she protect private history without turning knowledge into influence or revenge. Louise placed the recommendation back into Edward's hands. She said she would not keep the original until she had earned the trust it represented. For the first time since the confrontation began, he smiled. Her guilt became resolve. She promised no family dispute would change the seriousness of her work. and Edward finally allowed his anger to loosen. By morning, the struggle hidden behind closed doors would become visible to the world in one restrained but unforgettable public moment. The public did not see the argument, the signed page, or Camilla's stunned silence. They saw Lady Louise leaving Windsor beside her father, carrying a plain archival case, and holding her head high. Edward did not wave. He simply placed a reassuring hand behind his daughter's shoulder as they crossed the courtyard. Within hours, that quiet image became the symbol of a royal father refusing to let influence decide his child's future. Palace officials answered the growing attention with a restrained confirmation. Louise had joined a supervised preservation program connected to private family collections and historic royal material. A preservation program was structured training in protecting fragile records, cataloging them accurately, and controlling who could examine sensitive papers. That explanation mattered because it showed she had received responsibility, not a decorative royal favor. The statement never mentioned Camilla's plea, yet every chosen phrase carried weight. Merit, professional oversight, and established archival rules made clear that Louise's place was secure. Commentators immediately divided. Some praised Edward for defending his daughter's earned future. Others warned that his refusal had exposed a widening separation between royal households, where private loyalties were beginning to challenge palace unity. Louise felt the pressure before she understood its scale. She remained uncomfortable with the attention, fearing that public sympathy might turn serious work into spectacle. Edward stayed close beside her and refused to feed the drama. His restraint protected her because one careless response could allow critics to portray the appointment as a family campaign rather than a professional achievement. Then a broadcaster changed the story. During a documented evening report, the presenter revealed that Prince Philip had personally encouraged Louise's interest in preservation. The disclosure transformed the conflict from a palace quarrel into the fulfillment of a grandfather's guarded intention. The palace declined to challenge the account, signaling that Charles would not undermine Edward or question the legitimacy of the appointment. The following morning, a national newspaper placed the Windsor photograph across its front page beneath 4 words: Edward draws the line for Louise. Near the castle gates, a small crowd applauded as her car passed. Louise lowered her eyes, while her father quietly reminded her that the work still mattered more than the reaction. Camilla watched the same broadcaster describe Edward as a protective father. She switched off the television and remained silent. Contesting the decision now would only deepen the damage and make Louise appear more deserving. The public verdict had formed, and only the family's final reckoning remained before the wound could close. The argument had begun over access to the past, but its final meaning would be decided by the future Edward had secured for his daughter. Edward did not overthrow a monarch, seize a title, or demand a grand position for his daughter. He did something quieter and, within royal life, perhaps more difficult. He refused to let Lady Louise's future be postponed until it disappeared. By rejecting Camilla's plea, he drew a firm distinction between loyalty and submission. His decision protected more than an archival appointment. It defended the principle that service, preparation, and character must still matter inside a family shaped by rank. Louise began her work without a title, constitutional authority, or a new public platform. Constitutional authority meant the power to act within the monarchy's governing structure. She received none of that. Her future was secured through responsibility, which mattered because her success could no longer be dismissed as privilege. Every task would be measured, every judgment tested, and every step earned. Edward returned to his duties without celebrating Camilla's defeat. He understood that victory built on humiliation would only create another wound. His purpose had never been to weaken the queen consort. He had acted because allowing Louise to be quietly excluded would have taught the family that influence mattered more than effort. Camilla accepted the limit placed around the private archival arrangement. The refusal wounded her pride, but she did not challenge the appointment again. Charles then asked Edward to meet privately. The king admitted their father would have respected his determination. The brothers avoided the sharpest details, yet that single acknowledgement restored something the conflict had almost destroyed. Philip's deepest legacy was not hidden inside a sealed collection. It survived as a standard. Royal history had to be protected by people who valued duty more than visibility. Louise proved that a quiet life did not have to become an irrelevant one. Her restraint, once treated as permission to overlook her, became the very quality that made her trusted. Weeks later, Edward visited the archive and found his daughter repairing a damaged page from Philip's collection. Louise looked up from the paper. "I understand why this had to be protected." "So do I," he replied. The answer carried the whole battle. Edward's refusal had never been rebellion against the monarchy. It was preservation of Louise's dignity, Philip's wishes, and the belief that royal service must be earned rather than controlled. Her place was confirmed. Camilla's intervention ended, his choice stood. And so the final page belongs not to the plea Camilla made, but to the future Edward refused to surrender, and to the daughter now trusted to protect the royal family's past. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.